All right. Good evening. How is everybody tonight? Good? Good. Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here, and I'll be moderating our program tonight, our discussion. Let me just say that I believe this program is going to be great. It promises to be insightful and lively, and frankly, it's not going to be easy for me to keep this crew under control. But I've been in this position before, and it's worked out all right, so no worries there. Our focus tonight is organized crime in Philadelphia, a topic we have not dealt with extensively in any previous museum programs. But it's a rich topic, and we have a tremendous set of panelists with vast amounts of knowledge and experience to share. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to mention there will be a book signing after the event. After the program. We have books by two of our panelists available, and I highly recommend both of them. All right, so I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have two Georges on this panel, and so I'm going to refer to them probably as George M. And George A. During the course of this, so I'll remember. But I'm going to start by introducing them. So first of all, on the far end for me, we have George Anastasia. George, yes. George is, I would argue George is on the Mount Rushmore of American mob historians. He may not want that, how long ago that means, as long as he's been doing it, but he's spent more than 30 years reporting on crime, especially organized crime, for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's a grandson of Sicilian immigrants who settled in South Philadelphia. He's the author of 6 books of nonfiction, including Blood and Honor, Inside the Scarfo Mob, which is a very important book for tonight's talk. He also wrote Gotti's Rules, the story of John A. Light, Junior Gotti, and the demise of the American Mafia. And if you remember years ago, John A. Light spoke here in this room. And for the purposes of being in Las Vegas, he co-wrote Being Oscar, From Mob Lawyer to Mayor of Las Vegas, along with our own Oscar Goodman. So please welcome George Anastasia. Now our other George, George Martirano, is here in the middle, and he is not easy to summarize in a couple of sentences. He couldn't do it himself. First, he's the son of Raymond Long John Martirano, who was a well-known Philadelphia organized crime figure, and his name will probably come up more than once tonight. Second, in the 1970s, George followed in his father's footsteps and developed a quite large drug trafficking operation. As George would stress, he was mostly associated with marijuana, which is legal today in 24 states, so keep that in mind. In 1982, he was arrested in connection with a seizure of a truckload of marijuana. The government labeled him a kingpin, even though it was a first-time offender. George says he was talked into pleading guilty and expected a sentence of 5 to 10 years. In fact, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1984. Many believe this unusually harsh sentence was imposed as leverage to force George to flip on Philly mob members, which he did not do. He ended up serving 32 years and finally was released in 2015. Please welcome George Martirano. Did everybody bring their fan base with them? To my left is Alan Hornblum, who was born and raised in Philadelphia. He attained degrees from Penn State, Villanova, and Temple universities, and devoted his career to research and writing, although he has also been a prison literacy instructor, congressional staffer, lobbyist, law enforcement administrator, and college lecturer, and probably a few other things. Alan is perhaps best known for his writing on medical ethics, or the lack thereof, in regard to, for example, conducting medical experiments on prison inmates. Maybe we'll bring him back for a conversation about that topic in the future. For our purposes tonight, Alan's book on Philadelphia's notorious K&A gang, Confessions of a Second Story Man, is a fascinating peek inside one of the most prolific and successful burglary rings in history. And we'll be talking about that tonight. So please welcome Alan Hornblum. And last but not least is James Leonard. a criminal defense attorney from Atlantic City, New Jersey. If geography is not your strong point, Atlantic City is very close to Philadelphia and will play a major role in our story that we tell tonight. James, or Jim, has lived most of his life in Atlantic City, started his own practice at age 28, specializing in aggressive criminal defense litigation. Does that sound like somebody we know? Oscar Goodman, maybe? In 2003, he won 2 high-profile jury trials that established his reputation as a sought-after criminal defense attorney in New Jersey. Over the years, Jimmy has represented a number of individuals whom law enforcement officials, and this is the wording, keep in mind, and whom law enforcement officials have described as leaders of street gangs and mafia organizations, including Anthony Nicodemo, is that right, and Nicky Scarfo Jr. Please welcome Jimmy Leonard. Okay, so as we get started, I want to note that we simply don't have enough time to dive into the entire history of Philadelphia organized crime tonight. So we've decided that for our purposes, the story starts in 1959 when Angelo Bruno becomes the boss, kind of the modern era, right? So on the screens behind us, you're going to see a series of quotes from George Anastasia's book as well as Alan Hornblum's book. So we're going to start with this one. And everybody can see that well. And you don't have to read every word unless you want to. But I want to start by just talking about Philadelphia as a city and as sort of a breeding ground for the subject matter of our talk tonight. So George A., you grew up and worked as a journalist in Philadelphia for many, many years. Tell us a bit about what Philadelphia was like and how the mob fit into that culture.
Well, we're talking basically about South Philadelphia, which was the Italian-American community. And when I wrote the book, I tried to paint a picture of South Philadelphia. In South Philadelphia, dominant institutions are the Democratic Party, the Catholic Church, and the mob. And you belonged sometimes to all three. This South Philadelphia was very, very neighborhood-centric and parish. Everybody knew the corner they were from or the parish they were from. That was South Philadelphia, and the mob was a part of that, not a major part of it, but the mob grew out of that. And what's happened over time is, and I've mentioned this before, as we sit here today in 2024, the best and the brightest in the Italian-American community are now doctors, lawyers, and educators, and the mob is scraping the bottom of the gene pool. But back in Angelo Bruno's day, Bruno was a throwback. Bruno was a mafia boss from the 40s and the 30s. Bruno was a guy who understood what it was all about. Second and third generation guys, the mob becomes a way to make money. For Bruno, it was almost an institution.
Very good. Alan, you grew up in Philadelphia as well, not necessarily in South Philadelphia, but what kind of a place was it for you back then, and what are your recollections of the city?
Well, I would like to preface my remarks by complimenting everybody who was here, because you could be wasting time and losing money at a casino. You could be watching the NFL draft. Hopefully the Sixers will win tonight. Maybe it's happened already. But you're here trying to get an education, and I've taught at a number of colleges and give most of my lectures at universities and medical schools. So when I see you coming out for something like this, you know, it really gives me some faith that we're not all lost in America. But Philadelphia, the part I want to stress, and it's connected to what George said, besides being a neighborhood, a city of neighborhoods, it's a very parochial town, okay? We don't know of what's going on in New York. We don't know what's going on in Chicago. We don't know what's going on in Reading. You know, we are so centered on ourselves. And one of the best examples I can bring out, hopefully quickly, is when Philadelphia in the 80s was inundated with crime and drugs, and the people were afraid to go out of their house at 6 o'clock at night. I was spending a lot of time in Manhattan, and there was a tremendous revolution taking place up there. If any of you were from New York, or maybe you don't want to admit it, I'm not sure. But the point is, there was a tremendous, revolution taking place where people were coming back to the city. People were shopping, they're out on the street, crime's going down, Giuliani's getting credit, Bill Bratton, the commissioner's getting credit, and I'm going to city council meetings, and the city councilmen are putting pressure on the police. Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? I mean, it was like you have Philly and you have Vladivostok. You know, it was like it should have been 12 hours away by plane, but it was only an hour and a half drive. People in Philly they had no idea that you could deal with crime, and I had to take a politician that most of the people up here, Dwight Evans, who was state rep, a congressman now, we sat down with Bill Bratton. He learned more in an hour and a half about contemporary police fighting crime than all his life living in Philadelphia. That's just one of many examples I could give about how parochial Philly is, and it's a neighborhood town where people are proud of Frankfurt or Roxborough or Mayfair or any other of 50 neighborhoods. So I'll leave it there, but it's a very tight community. We do not welcome folks from the outside telling us what we should do, even though it would benefit us. It's very unique, and there's many other things that I've given in lectures. There's something strange about the DNA of Philadelphia, and maybe 200 years ago it was called the Athens of America, but no longer.
Very good. So George Martirano, you grew up there. You were closer to this whole mob thing than any of us. Tell us about your growing up there and what Philadelphia was like for you.
Well, I come from a real ethnic, David Rumden neighborhood. The 600 block of Fitzwater Street, 30s and 40s had a name called Gunman's Row. If you wanted a hitman, that's where you came. They had cafes. It's where my father was brought up. He used to shine the shoes of the famous gangster, Tony the Stinger Cugino. I mean, these are guys, I'm a writer, so I wrote about that situation. But the first time I realized that I was in another world, I couldn't realize it because I was only 2 years old. There was a gangster named Benny the Gimp from this Gunman's Row, one of these cafes. He used to carry two long barrel 38s. Anyway, he used to go to my mother, bang on the door. Give me the baby, give me the baby. My mother, back days, everybody was married 16 or 17, a couple dates, and then you had to get married. So my mother was 17, and she had me and my sister Marianne. So she would give me to this gangster, and she used to shake. But what can she do? Now, this gangster used to take me up to the corner and give me ice cream, chocolate. And I'm in a stroller. And he used to get a big kick out of all this ice cream going over this baby. So, lo and behold, one day, as he's administrating to this little baby in the little stroller, the car jumps the pavement. Shooters get out and they kill him. They kill him up this close to me. So now the homicide detectives, they see the stroller, where's the baby? So they're investigating the neighborhood. It was a mob hit. And so they hid me. My mother took me and hid me around my father's mother around the corner. But the investigating intensified because it was a mob situation. So now I'm 2 years old. They moved me to 90 miles away to a seashore town, Wildwood, New Jersey. So I'm 2 years old. I'm on a lamp. So that's the beginning. That's basically the beginning of my life with the mob.
Right, and that's... So, George A., you touched on this, Angelo Bruno, but I want to come back to what kind of a boss was he? He was a boss from 1959 to 1980. That's a long time in any community. What kind of a boss was he, and what kinds of things? What was his way of doing things?
Well, I think Angelo Bruno was very entrepreneurial, and two, it was, unlike today with the celebrity gangsters, make money, not headlines. Don't call attention to your stuff. Stay in the shadows. It's a business. Murder was a negotiating tool of last resort. If everything else failed, somebody might get popped. But ordinarily it was, this is business, this is what we're about. And it was basically gambling and loan sharking. And Bruno built an empire around that. And he was known, today they call him the Docile Don. In the day, he wasn't known as the Docile Don. He became the Docile Don because of what came after him. The violence and the treachery and everything that happened post-Bruno. But Angelo Bruno was very much a throwback. This was the way the mob was in the 40s and 50s, and that's where he came from. And that's the way he ran Philadelphia. He also was, I think, strongly aligned with the Gambino crime family in New York, which was part of his power came from there. But Bruno ran an organization that made money. And Bruno ran an organization where violence was a secondary issue. And I think that's why he lasted for 21 years.
Yeah. Now, George, you knew him pretty well. And he's your god.
Me or just you and me?
No, you. Okay. You're them. Yeah, what do you remember about Angelo Bruno?
Well, he was my godfather. He christened me, and his wife was Sue, Kamar Sue. And it was traditional, family thing. When you're raised in the mob world like I was, and I tried to get away from it because it was always strict. You had to live a certain way. So I tried to get away from it. So anytime I could, take off and do something. But as far as Ange was concerned, I still live by his principles. I'll give you a sentence. One of his principles, an excuse can be the truth, but it's still an excuse. So that was one of his principles, and I lived by that.
So George, he had a long run, but in the late 70s, as this quote suggests, he ran into some problems, and he was ultimately killed on March 1st, 1980. What happened there?
March 21st, 1980.
I'm sorry, March 21st. Yeah.
I mean, I think two things that undermined Angelo Bruno's reign. One was the coming of casino gambling to Atlantic City. That enhanced the value of Philadelphia, and at the same time, it made Philadelphia more attractive to other crime families. Everybody wanted a piece of Atlantic City. And I think at that point, Bruno already had more money than he probably needed, and he was okay with letting Atlantic City be an open city, and I think it bothered a lot of his people. Secondly, Bruno supposedly had this prohibition on don't deal drugs. Now, there's a certain hypocrisy in that because George's father was one of Bruno's tightest guys, and George's father was in the drug trade. Another incident that occurred right before Bruno was killed is that two members of the Gambino crime family, Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino, Sicilian mobsters, opened a restaurant in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And basically that's Philadelphia territory. And Bruno welcomed them to the area. And they were drug dealers. They were part of the international pizza connection. So Bruno's own soldiers, if you will, said there's a certain hypocrisy in all of this. And that led to some of them plotting to kill him. And that's what happened.
And as this quote suggests, the assassination of Bruno set in motion an unbelievable decade of violence in Philadelphia. And we can just talk about this, starting with Phil Testa becomes the boss after Bruno.
He was the underboss, yes.
He was the underboss. He becomes the boss for about a year.
Almost to the day. I mean,
And,
Bruno was killed on March 21st. Testa was killed on March 15th of a year later. The Ides of March.
What was behind that, do you think?
I think part of it was a power play. There were different groups within the organization that wanted Testa out of the way. They wanted to take over. And it was a brutal murder. They had planted a bomb under his porch, and they loaded the bomb with roofer's nails. And as he walked in the door, somebody in a remote, in a van, pushed a button, and the bomb literally blew him through the front door and shredded the bottom half of his body. It was a very brutal murder.
And he lived for a while, right?
Matter of hours, and but it was gruesome. And the people in the neighborhood, I remember talking to them after it happened. It's not far from an oil refinery. They thought the refinery had blown up. That's how loud the explosion was. I mean, and the house was decimated. It was a horrible hit, and the beginning of the cycle of violence that basically undermined and destroyed any stability that had existed in Philadelphia.
And so here we enter Nicky's.
Let me ask
yes,
you
please.
one quick, this is a trivia question you take away from this. There's only been one mob boss in America celebrated in a song by Bruce Springsteen.
Nah.
There's a song, Atlantic City, and then there's a line in there, they blew up the Chicken Man last night. Phil Testa was known as the Chicken Man, and Springsteen celebrated that in his song.
That's right. So enter Nicky Scarfo. And George, you just kind of left the objectivity on the sidelines when you describe him, or maybe you're just being completely and utterly accurate as to who he was. But just give us an introduction to Nicky Scarfo.
Nicky Scarfo was, Nicky Scarfo had been banished to Atlantic City back in the 60s when Atlantic City was nothing. He was the mob caretaker when there was nothing to take care of. And he basically sat in Atlantic City for 20 years doing not much of anything. But it turned out he's in the right place at the right time. Casino gambling comes. Scarfo owed his rise in the organization to Phil Testa. Testa liked him and made him his consigliere after Testa took over. And Scarfo was a psychopath. And Scarfo was a guy who was the antithesis of Bruno. For Bruno, murder was a negotiating tool of last resort. For Scarfo, it was a calling card. And so what you had during the Scarfo era was this tremendous amount of violence, totally undermined the organization. And, you know, we sit here and talk about crime families. Philadelphia at its peak maybe had 80 members, maybe 70 members. It wasn't a big organization. And during the Scarfo era, 20 to 25 guys were killed. And when Scarfo was indicted, 20 others were indicted with him. So you do the numbers. The family was decimated by this, the approach that Scarfo took. Grab it with both fists, take control, use violence to settle any score.
I've added a second page, if you didn't know, of quotes, because you got a lot of thoughts on him. So this is an appropriate time then was turned to Jimmy Leonard, who our Atlantic City man, to talk about Atlantic City, because this was Scarfo. This is where Scarfo made his name. This is where he thought that Bruno was falling down and he could pick it up, and he did in some ways. But what I remember, what we think about in Las Vegas at least, is that when gambling was legalized in Atlantic City, there was a lot of puffed up chests in New Jersey saying, we're not going to let the mob have anything to do with Atlantic City. We're going to be tougher than Las Vegas. We're going to be tougher than everybody. But what actually happened?
Well, I think George said it. Scarfo had been in Atlantic City from the 60s on. So when the governor, Brendan Byrne, at that time, made that declaration that to the mob, keep your hands out of Atlantic City, keep your filthy hands out of Atlantic City, they were already there. They had been there for quite some time. So they were very skillful at infiltrating, much different than what happened in Las Vegas, where there was a casino skim. The mob, Scarfo ran, him and his nephew ran Scarf Inc., which was a concrete company. They poured concrete for the foundation of the first few casinos that were built in Atlantic City. Other associates had rebar companies that were putting, the iron there. They were controlling the largest hotel casino union in the city. They controlled the linens. They controlled so many different facets of the casino business, where they weren't necessarily taking a skim, ultimately like the Chicago mob was here in Las Vegas. But I was born in Atlantic City. My father was an Atlantic City police officer during this era. I lived right outside of Atlantic City. My law practice is based in Atlantic City. But I remember being a young kid reading headlines that were all about murder, Scarfo, this one, that one. And you were very aware of who Nicky Scarfo was and what he was. And he was a gangster. There was an unprecedented amount of violence. I mean, they killed a judge in Atlantic City. They killed a judge in 1978, which is unheard of to think about that. And Scarfo continued until 1987, when he was ultimately arrested and brought to justice. But my first, involvement with Atlantic City as a young kid was Atlantic City was a casino town. And I thought it was a casino town until I came to Las Vegas and realized that that was a casino town and Atlantic City was a town that had casinos. Very different, very different. And very different today. Back when I was younger, Steve Wynn was a presence in Atlantic City. Our former president was a presence in Atlantic City. None of that exists today. Atlantic City today is very different than it was in the 80s and the 90s and quite frankly, even the early 2000s. Two very different towns. A lot of parallels between Nicky Scarfo and Tony Spilatro in Las Vegas. But I think historically, Scarfo was more violent. I think he was more powerful. And his reign lasted very short. It was 1981 to 1987. But packed in those 6 years, there was a lot of violence. It was unprecedented, certainly in the Philadelphia, Atlantic City area. Something that I don't know that you had seen condensed since Al Capone in the 30s. I mean, New York, there was a lot of violence and organized crime, but this was a very, very volatile period of time.
Jimmy, so this is not necessarily a mob question, but why do you think Atlantic City has fallen off so much and Las Vegas continues to move forward?
So when I graduated high school, I worked in the casino business. 1992, I took my first job in the casino, and I worked at different jobs in different casinos. And at that time, I remember during the orientation, there was a map of the continental United States, and there was a red dot on Atlantic City and a red dot for Las Vegas. And it was basically one of those, like, you are here in Atlantic City. And then they had the next slide where it was Atlantic City's customer base went to Ohio, went down to Florida, went to New England, and Las Vegas went south, went west. And it was Atlantic City and Las Vegas. They were the only gaming destinations in the United States. So my office is in Atlantic City, and I live now 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia, 40 minutes from Atlantic City. I can get to casinos today in the state of Pennsylvania that are closer to me than Atlantic City is, and it's 40 minutes away. So that map of Atlantic City and Las Vegas, you could make a map of Atlantic City and Philadelphia. They're 60 miles apart. You can go 30 miles in one direction. That's Atlantic City's radius, and Philadelphia has the rest of it with legalized casino gambling. So quite frankly, Atlantic City was no longer a destination where Las Vegas continues to be one.
Yep, yep. So I want to, there's so many different things we can explore, but I want to dive into the K&A gang. So we're going to step away for a couple of minutes from South Philly, and we're going to move into a neighborhood called Kensington. Alan, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Kensington is a very old section of the city. It's one of the river wards, and it's a generally low-income, working-class community. Hardworking people and families, loaded with corner bars and taverns, and many, many factories and warehouses. It was the economic engine of Philadelphia, the economic engine of Pennsylvania. You had a tremendous number of textile mills. You had shipyards like Cramp. You had Philco Ford. You had Stetson hats, and you had so many sweater factories and clothing factories. And there was lots of employment there. People had small homes. They called them Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, one room on top of another, very narrow. You could touch the walls by putting your hands out. And the folks worked hard. They didn't make much money. But there was an element there, certainly after the Second World War, guys were coming back. They didn't want to work in a factory. They didn't want to work all day in a hot, grimy atmosphere and have, chum change the show for it. These were guys who wanted to live large. They wanted the women. They wanted a new Cadillac every year. They wanted to stay out late. They wanted to sleep late. These were the criminal element, and they did go into some bank robbery, convenience stores, stick-ups, what have you. But a fellow named Willie Sears gets them started with something that was eventually called production work, a system of burglary that proved very, very successful. And in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they put burglary on the map to the point that the FBI had to eventually send in a crew of FBI agents to shut them down because reports were coming in from all over the country, high-end communities from Bar Harbor to Boca Raton, that there's a crew coming through and they ripped the hell out of, 3 or 4 neighborhoods over a weekend. It could be Cary, North Carolina, or it could be, the Hamptons. And the local police had no way to stop them because this group of men, and, it's different than what the Georges have been talking about. They're talking about organized crime. My book and my group is disorganized crime. It's the Irish. These Irishmen were tough, ballsy, back alley fighters and drinkers. They didn't want a boss. They didn't want a capo. They don't want, captains and a top man telling them what to do. They were disorganized and proud of it. But they did have these little units of friends who would go out after drinking a few hours at a bar. They'd ask, one another, you want to do a piece of work? So they go into Princeton, they go to Jersey, they go to the Oranges, they go up to maybe outside of Manhattan, and they would start hitting neighborhoods and houses, and they could take everything valuable in the house in a period of 15 minutes. The system was basically very simple. They would drive around in cars, 4 men in a unit generally, where you had a driver. 3 would get out when they found a house that looked very promising. That house had 2 things that signified, this is a target. It had a mezuzah on the wall, and it had an alarm system there that they could see from the highway. It's not that they were anti-Semitic. They wanted the money. They figured the Jews had it. They knew that the Jewish families, spent on all sorts of trinkets and goods and artwork and what have you, and that's what they wanted. So they would go into these high-end communities and rip the hell out of them. And in a period of 15 minutes, they would take everything of value there, from silverware to paintings. Then they would go to another house and then another house. They'd eventually drive back about 2 in the morning to Kensington, celebrate their triumphs in a bar. And they were considered Robin Hoods in the neighborhood because they didn't beat the hell out of the neighborhood. They didn't target them because nobody had money there. But they spent their money there. They bought the cars there. They had parties there. So it's an incredible story about these Irish, thugs who never got out of 9th grade, but they were streetwise and they had a system. They were smart enough to know never to carry a gun, because if you had a gun, you're liable to use it, or if you get caught, you're going to get a lot more time, because they were making so much money. They hired the best lawyers like Steve Lachine and Bobby Simone and others that we know of here. Maybe you do if you come from the Philly area. But they were certainly very prolific, and it ran from the 50s into the 70s, and by the mid-70s, as you read, they're getting up in years, and they start moving into the drug trade themselves.
I want to come back to
helps.
that. We'll come back to that in just a second. I want to ask, though, George M., you knew some of these guys.
Yes.
Tell us your story about your interactions with the K&A gang.
Well, my father, one of the main guys was John Burglary, extreme tough gangster. And John opened the bar right on K&A meant Kensington and Allegheny. Quickest way to, it's where remember Rocky, the first Rocky, the neighborhood with the overpass, with the gym? Well, that's K&A. That's where Alan created this book, great book. And so they had a bar up there.
Is that the?
That's
yeah.
And they were the best thieves in the country. But what I liked about them, they stole and robbed for over 20 years. Never hurt a person. Never hurt a person. Anyway, I go over there, and it's a Saturday afternoon, and places jumping this and that. So I go there, and I pull the plug out of the jukebox. So now the place is quiet. I said, listen up. listen up. And I pulled 5,000 out of my pocket. True story. I says, listen, see this 5,000 is always going to be in my back pocket. If any of you K&A guys who bring me jewelry, you get the 5,000 immediately, and then say they wanted 30 or 40 for the jewelry, and then I would naturally go check the jewelry out next day, and they never try to cheat me. But what I was trying to implement in this bar, what was the name of the bar? Berkeley's bar.
Molly McGuire's.
Molly McGuire's. Well, I was trying to implement that. They knew if they make a score, I'm sitting with 5,000. And believe me, I always, when I get up in the morning and left the house, I put 5,000 in my pocket. And you see these guys every week. Every week they give me a little bag of jewelry. I give them the 5,000. I made out with them. But again, that was our way of life. But like I said, they never hurt innocent people.
So let's go back to the K&A gang and why did they stop burglaries and move into drugs? And what did they do?
In the mid-'70s, you start to see the police becoming more sophisticated. The FBI sent a big group of agents into Philadelphia, and they told communities around the country that had been hit, this is the Irish mob out of Philly, this is the K&A gang. It's not the celestial heavens open up and stealing from these high-end communities. It's a certain crew out of Philly, the Irish mob. And so you have the FBI coming in, the local police are becoming more sophisticated. You now also have the technology. You have the alarm systems at houses. You have cameras. It's not as easy to break into a house as it once was in 59 or 62 or 68. You know, it's much more difficult. Plus the men themselves are getting up in years. They're no longer 23, able to jump fences or climb up into a building, carry a bag of tools with them. You know, they're getting up in years, and the drug trade's around. More people are getting into it, and it was just logical to them. You can make 10 times the money with 1/10 the effort. And they did. Many of them got into the business. Some stayed away because they didn't like drugs. They thought it was very bad. Some said it was even unpatriotic. But the point is, a lot of them did. And that caused, in part, also the downfall, because now when they got caught, they weren't doing 3 years or 5 years for a burglary. They were doing 40 years. And they started to flip on their partners. And the drug trade itself was much more violent. When you're doing a transaction for P2P or Coke or whatever, and you know, somebody's giving you $40,000, $50,000 in a transaction for the product, a lot of people got clipped because it was easier just to take the money and, you know, what have you. So people start getting shot, put in trunks of cars, and that in itself, as well as the long prison sentences, was the termination of the burglary, which had become a cottage industry. You know, people, you know, well, a lot of folks in some homes, they want to be a doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, or a ball player. They wanted to be a K&A burglar.
Excellent. So I want to, we're back in South Philly or in Atlantic City or both now. I want to move forward the chronology to around 1987. Nicky Scarfo is arrested. Dozens of other Philly mobsters are convicted and sent to prison. Why did this happen, George A.?
Well, you know, Scarfo had created this violent world, and the FBI, the Pennsylvania State Police, the New Jersey State Police, and the local police all started to focus on the gang wars that were going on, and Scarfo became the primary target. He's taken off the scene, and it creates this void within the Philadelphia crime family. And as I said, over that course of that period, 20, 25 guys were killed, and now another 20 are going to jail. You're not left with a lot of people out there. That decimated the crime family.
One of the things that I was thinking about, too, is you told me everybody was wearing a wire or talking into a bug.
Well, I mean, that's what came after. After Scarfo, you had a series of mob bosses and a series of investigations, all built around electronic surveillance. The Philadelphia crime family at that point was probably the most dysfunctional mob family in America. They were kind of the Simpsons of the underworld. And they also were the most recorded. There was somebody wearing a body wire or a bug was in place, And one of the things that, talking to defense attorneys, that Jimmy could tell you this as well, if you've got electronic surveillance and you've got tapes and you go on trial, you can't cross-examine a tape. You can attack the credibility of a cooperating witness. You're lying, da, da. But if you got your own client on tape saying, we're going to put 2 in the back of that guy's ear, how are you going to cross-examine that? And that's what happened in Philadelphia again and again and again in the RICO prosecutions that came post-Scarfo. There always was an electronic component. And the other interesting thing, in my estimation, I think this is correct, there have been 4 mob-making ceremonies recorded in the history of the mafia in America. One was in Medford, Massachusetts. One, I think, was in Toronto. The other 2 were members of the Philadelphia crime family, 2 different times. A guy wore a body wire to his own making ceremony. That says a lot about what happened in Philadelphia.
That's for sure. So we're kind of into the 90s now. This is almost recent history. Scarfo is deposed. Stanford takes over. But then a few other names start popping up. I want to understand this. Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino.
Right. Stanford becomes the boss. He's Sicilian-born, and he takes over with New York backing. And Joey Merlino is from the neighborhood. And the young guys around Merlino perceive Stanford as an interloper. He calls them the Little Americans, and they call him the Greaser. And Ralph Natale was a guy who had been with Bruno, been away for drug dealing. He aligned with Merlino, and it's Merlino Natale versus Stanford. And the irony in all of this is Ralph Natale thought he was Don Corleone. He really was Uncle Junior. I mean, he was propped up, but Merlino and those guys were running the family, and Natale eventually got jammed up and became a cooperator.
George, you didn't mention his association with the Bruno hit.
Who was that?
Stanford.
Stanford. John Stanford was the driver on the night Bruno was killed. He drove Bruno home. Stanford always denied any involvement, but Stanford was one of the conspirators and probably the only one to survive that hit. Yeah. So, I mean, Philadelphia's a soap opera. It's a soap opera, and as we sit here tonight, we've talked about all of this. I'm still waiting for Hollywood to say, you know what, there's a hell of a story here, let's make a movie. Nobody's done it.
Would it be a comedy or a drama?
Well, George, you're unfortunately looking at a lot of this from college, as they say. You're not in Philadelphia at the time, but you know what's going on in Philadelphia. What are you seeing in the 80s and the 90s?
Well, I was born and raised in it, and to me, I was in the in crowd. I wasn't. My father was the mob. I wanted to make money. So the only way I could make money was get away from the day-to-day mob stuff and do my own thing, which was, I started slinging weed as a young kid and to my adulthood. So I basically knew the life very well. And if you wanted to be a young guy, a hanger-on, you're not going to make any money. You're not going to tell you, go do this, go shoot that guy, go do this. And I wasn't into that. I was into making a few bucks. That was my thing. But, my godfather was Angelo Bruno. My father was Long John. But I looked at it differently. A lot of young guys would want to hang around those guys, type of guys. I tried to get away. I wanted to make my money selling weed. And, I like to tell a quick story about the K&A gang.
Okay.
With the ice cream truck. I told you that story?
Tell me.
These K&A guys are like, they don't need a movie, they need a scripted series. George Allen should be the director of that. These guys were, so anyway, a guy died in that crew. So they come downtown, me and my father, and they needed money to bury the guy. And that was customary. Knock around guy, dies, he don't have the money, his family, so they go get 500 this way, 500. So we gave couple grand to bury this guy. And a couple weeks go by, and Me and my father are standing in one of our restaurants, one of my restaurants, and this K&A guy, Burglary, and Nolan, Jimmy Nolan, they pull up with an ice cream truck. These kind of ice cream trucks, they were paneled. You know, you had the side panel, you know, and you open up, and they had dry ice back then. So they come to us, and they says, you know, we need money to bury this guy. I said, wait a minute, we gave you money to bury the guy. He says, yeah, but we went gambling money. And now, it's a true story, ladies and gentlemen. Now they throw the funeral parlor, threw the guy out. So they went and got an ice cream truck. And they had the guy in the ice cream truck. And they opened the back of the ice cream truck, and all I seen was 2 feet. So my father was a very principled guy. He got so disgusted, he just walked in a restaurant. And I'm stuck on the sidewalk with these burglary and another guy, and they got a guy in an ice cream truck. And I wound up going to my pocket. I had $500-600, so they got me again. But that's these K&A guys. If any should be, forget about me, the mob, but these Irish characters were unbelievable.
George, so two things were happening, it seems to me, at that time. It's happening all over, but you had, you know, all the bugs and the wiretaps and so forth, and the wearing of wire. Guys were flipping like crazy, too.
Yeah,
and Phil, can you talk a little bit about Phil Leonetti? Because that was a big deal.
Yeah, Phil Leonetti was Nicky Scarfo's underboss, and he also was Nicky Scarfo's nephew. So there was a blood relationship there. So Leonetti flipped. It was a long list of cooperators in Philadelphia, but Leonetti was probably the biggest name. And that undermined the whole aura, if you will, of organized crime in Philadelphia. I mean, everybody's a cooperator. Who are you going to trust? And again, it's the stability of the organization between the violence, the electronic surveillance, and cooperating witnesses. It just was destroyed. And Philadelphia, in a lot of ways, if you look at what's happened to Cosa Nostra, let me say this. This is just an aside, but this is my own personal bugaboo. It's Cosa Nostra. It's not La Cosa Nostra.
Right.
The FBI loves three initials: FBI, DEA, IRS. Somebody in the FBI at some point wrote a memo, La Cosa Nostra. La Cosa Nostra. Cosa Nostra is our thing. La Cosa Nostra is the our thing. Makes no freaking sense. But so if you come away with nothing else from tonight, it's Cosa Nostra, not La Cosa Nostra. So all of that is to say, the Philadelphia crime family, what's happened in Philadelphia, is a microcosm of what's happened to Cosa Nostra throughout America. Electronic surveillance, cooperating witnesses, WITSEC, the ability to testify and disappear, go into a new... You know, back in the day, there's a famous story about Kid Twist. Abraham Rillis was a mob guy who was going to testify against Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia and those guys. And Kid Twist was being held in the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, waiting to testify. 6th floor. 4 or 5 police detectives guarding him. And all of a sudden, he does a header out the window. And the word was, he was a canary. He could sing, but he couldn't fly. That was always the attitude about cooperators. That all changed in the 80s and 90s. Now you could cooperate, get a new identity, and disappear. And we saw it again and again and again. Philadelphia embodied all of that in terms of the demise of the American Mafia, the demise of Cosa Nostra, not La Cosa Nostra.
Something we've been talking about the last day or so in our own conversations is how, and you know, obviously my museum is part of this, but this sort of commodification of being a mobster. And, you know, Joey Merlino has a podcast, and Michael Francis has a podcast, and you know, all these folks have podcasts, they have merchandise, they come and they go on speaking tours or whatever. And many of those were government witnesses. They had flipped and become government witnesses. What is your general, and they've got the mob wives phenomenon and everything. George, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I'm retired now. I was the middleman between that world and the reading public. You don't need me anymore, because all of these guys are out there now. and they're telling their stories. The problem with it is there's no filter. So they can say whatever they want, and you're not getting the full story. You're going to get their version of the story. The interesting thing about Joey Merlino is he's not a cooperator. All these other guys
Right.
were cooperators. Joey was the alleged mob boss of Philadelphia. Now he's got his own podcast, The Skinny with Joey Merlino. He handicaps sporting events, and his reputation on the street was he was a lousy, lousy gambler. But he handicapped, and then he goes on a rant about cooperators, and that's his podcast. And the mob has become like, it's a brand. It's Prada, it's Dolce & Gabbana, and it's the mafia. Pretty soon they'll have a clothing line.
George, you were in prison for literally 32 years. And
32 plus years, yes.
And you got out, even though there's a whole story, we could do a whole program just on how you got out, but you came into a world that was very, very different than when you went in.
Well,
How have you adjusted to this world?
Well, they gave me life, no parole for marijuana. I never got caught with a joint. And I'm in a cell. Years are going by, decades are going by. And then I hear Colorado went recreational. California, I hear several states, people are buying the weed. I'm dying in the cell. Nonviolent first offender for weed. As a matter of fact, one warden, I've been in so many jails I can't remember. One warden told me that he went on vacation with his wife in Colorado, and his wife liked to administrate. We call it administrate when you want to smoke something or take a gummy. And he said, George, all I could think about, my wife went in there to buy something to smoke, and I'm standing outside. True story, ladies and gentlemen. And the warden says, all I could think about you. You're languishing in the cell forever. And my wife's in there buying weed. So, But my bottom line, like I said, I did 32 plus years, 5 years in solitary. I don't know what you understand about solitary, but it's not about me, because I believe wholeheartedly better men and women. Prison is not about men, it's about women also. Better men and women have died in prison than I.
So as we start to wind down here, Alan, I want to ask you, I have a sense that, well, I'll ask a couple people here. So everybody, got convicted, everybody went to prison, not everybody. A lot of people went to prison, and a lot of them get out, and George got out even. But how about these K&A members? I mean, they've gotten out, but what's happened to them?
It generally across the board, 95% of prisoners do come back into society. So we should pay attention to what happens in prison, because you don't want somebody coming out worse than when they went in. And this is my prison reform side, where I've spent a lot of time, even though I ran the Philly Sheriff's Office and things like that years before, I was a prison reformer, and I always try to educate people. Yeah, we can lock them up, get them off the streets, beat the hell out of them, whatever you want to do with them in prison, but those folks are coming back out again. And you really don't want them to take out their animus and anger on the neighbor or the public. But George is somewhat interesting, and that it's always generally thought, if you do 8-10 years in a prison, when you come out, you ain't going to be right. That's going to damage you being inside there. But there are a few guys, George is one of them, who come out after long terms in the 20s or 30s, and they can function just like that. It's remarkable how somebody can continue walking. It's like if you're in bed for 2 weeks and you try to stand up and walk around, it's a good chance you're going to go down. And it's the same way, being locked up all that time. I dealt with a guy that they may know called Cowboy Barnes. I met him during my research on the K&A gang. Spent 50 years behind bars. He shot a cop in the mid-'60s. He paralyzed the cop, and then he finally got out, and many, many years later. And it's incredible, what it can do to you and how it, wreaks havoc with your relationships and whatever. And George may have been a lot better with it. But when I took Cowboy Barnes, I was given a talk at a Barnes & Noble on the main line in Philadelphia. He had nothing to do. He had no friends. Everybody was gone that he knew on the street. So he was hanging around me, and I took him to this talk, and we got there early. And I said, let's go get something to eat before we go to the bookstore. And we sat down. He could not read a menu. They don't give menus out in prison. And he didn't know what the hell to do in the restaurant there. And so I could see he was getting uncomfortable, and I said, okay, let's go out. So we went to a divey-ass joint on the main line, if you can find one, and he felt much more comfortable where he could see the food and just order like that. And there were situations where he hadn't been on a bus or a subway in 50 years, and he couldn't even step. He was walking. He didn't see the curb. He goes right over and smashes his head, breaks his glasses, and so forth. You know, you can be in there, and it really does a lot of damage to you. But then again, you can come out and be great. And I actually knew George's father better than I knew him. I knew Long John because I was on the board of the Philly prison system, and I had to do tours of the prisons to see if everything's running properly. His father's cell was like a bodega. You couldn't believe it. Every cell is stark and barren and dirty and smelly. You got a toilet, maybe a sink, and a chair and a metal bed. His father was like Gimbel's department store. It was incredible. He had fruit, he had vegetables, he had newspapers and whatever. You know, he had more stuff than some of the corner stores in the city. But that's what happens when you've got the juice and connections. People are giving you things, and George, I'm sure, has heard this, and others, you know, if you're connected, stuff will be brought into you. And he could have been making money in the jail, Long John, with all the stuff he had. And so there's a lot of interesting stories in prisons, and Jeff is promising to bring them to you in the future. So maybe if we get good ratings, we'll come back here again for the sequel.
George, so this is Blood and Honor. You know, I hope everybody buys both books tonight. They're really, really insightful. But this one is right, you know, is right in that top five must-read books. And one of the reasons for that is the insights that the book is framed around a guy who was a Philly mob guy through and through, Nick Caramandy, and him talking about what it was like to be in the mob, and very, you know. I guess he was right out of Central Casting, but he was a very eloquent guy, right?
Nick was a consummate con man. I mean, his whole life was built around telling stories to get over on people. And then when he began cooperating, he just transferred that storytelling ability to his testimony and to multiple interviews I had with him to write the book. And I think the book works because his voice is very strong in that book. And this was a guy who, I know where he is now. He's out in middle America living in a trailer park. If he could go back to that world in that time, that was the high point of his life. And he still regrets that he can't do that. He knows he can't go back, that's done. And his basic position was, I had no choice. Scarfo was going to kill me. He had gotten involved in a scam, got jammed up, and as I said, Scarfo was a violent guy. There's no way out. If you screwed up, you're going to get killed. And Caramandy said he had to testify, and that's how we ended up connecting.
You know, over the years, people like him have been on this stage, and we've had them at the museum at different times. I almost wish we could get him out here. I don't know if that's possible, but it would be amazing. Well, why don't we end there, and let's open it up to questions. I have a little trouble seeing with the lights, but if I do this, I can see. And if you raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone out to you.
This is for George M. You did all those years for marijuana. Are you still involved with the marijuana industry, and what's your thoughts on it?
Well, I came home to this industrial boom, and with friends of mine from the neighborhood, he's in the audience, Michael, he said, you know, we got to create the Growfather. You're the Godfather, I'm the Growfather. I think there's another friend of mine in the audience, actually, who he had a dream. A couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, he was with me every day, Constantine, and he says, listen, I had a dream. I said, yeah. He says, you were on the throne and everybody was bowing down and calling you the Growfather. So I contemplated. I said, you know what? We're going to create the brand. And that's how the Growfather is. We're in Jersey right now. We manufacture in Jersey. We're in every dispensary in Jersey. Hopefully, we're working with Grow Magazine. They're here, out there in the audience. I think one gentleman's filming Grow
Is
Magazine.
everybody getting a free sample, George?
Anyway, so
That's how you got the crowd.
I want to
Answer's no,
wait 32 plus years for something now that it's legalized. And most important thing, ladies and gentlemen, we're creating jobs across the country.
Yeah. Here's another.
Hey there, thank you for being out here. Is the Philadelphia Mafia still alive and well?
That's the question I wanted to ask. So where are we at with the Philly mob today?
There's probably 20 guys, and the sad part is between Jimmy and George and I, we could probably name all 20 guys. Shouldn't be like that, but it is. But the problem is, where are you going to make money? Where are you going to make your money now? Extortion, everybody cooperates, so you're not going to try that. Gambling, everything's legalized. So unfortunately, a lot of these guys drift into drugs and they get jammed up, and there's no future in that.
To answer your question, we talked about the Scarfo era. In 5 or 6 years, there was 20-some murders in Philadelphia by virtually every measuring stick. There may have been one in the last 12 years. So I think that answers that question.
Yeah.
Hi. So you talk mostly, I think, about the Sicilian Italian mob. There was a Jewish mob in Philadelphia as well. Were there connections between them? Did they divide business in different ways? I'd be interested in any comment about that.
Excuse me, who are you addressing? Which member?
Well, it's okay.
Anyone.
I'll direct that. So, George, why don't you start, George, and then I'll let the other George come
Yeah,
in.
I mean, I think in the 40s, 30s and 40s, there was a strong Jewish mob in Philadelphia. But unfortunately, from Italian-American perspective, I think Jewish gangsters, second generation, they wanted their kids to go in a different direction. And education became important. And there isn't as strong a Jewish element in organized crime in the 70s and 80s as it had been in the 40s and 50s.
Except in Las Vegas, but that's another story. George, you were around a long time. Did you get involved with, you interact with Jewish mob guys?
Yeah, well, Philadelphia was the last segment of the Jew mob. That was the last city, and then it faded. It was under Willie Weisberg,
And Nick Rosen. And
Nick
those guys.
Rosen. They controlled all the vending. If you wanted to buy any kind of vending machine, pinball machine, jukebox, you had to go through the Jew mob. But they were the absolute last Jew mob in the country. And like George says, their children went on to be lawyers and doctors, and it faded away.
I spent years on the Pennsylvania Crime Commission investigating organized crime and official corruption. And it's really the evolution of America with regard to ethnicities. When groups come to the country, such as the early 1900s, the Jews, the Italians, the Greeks, or what have you, there's a segment that gravitates towards crime to get ahead and succeed. And as George said, as the years go by, they become more sophisticated, well off. They want better for their kids. So a lot of the Jews, you know, they push their kids for education, and maybe they're not as as bright as George. George is an Ivy League guy, goes to fine school. He uses a lot of polysyllabic terminology, which is the reason both his daughters get master's degrees, so they understand the old man. And so there's a lot of this that goes on. But in our crime commission reports, we talk about the Dominican mob, we talk about the black mob, we talk about the other ethnicities that are coming to America in more recent years, and they are the ones that pick up from the Italians. Yeah. Okay, the Jews faded out, and the Greeks faded out. The Italians are almost gone, but you have these newer ethnicities that are struggling to make it in the country, and they are the ones that are moving the drugs or the prostitution or the loan sharking or whatever. So it's just a natural phenomenon that takes place in a country like America, where those more recently in the country try to make a buck however they can. Some legit, some less so.
Let's see if we got maybe one or two more questions over here.
Yes. Gambling was legalized in Nevada around 1933, I think.
31.
31, okay. Well, I said about.
That's all right.
How did it take so long, and who influenced New Jersey to legalize gambling about 40 years later in Atlantic City?
Yeah, well, so that's actually, let me rephrase your question if I can. Why did Atlantic City finally legalize gambling?
Well, 2 years prior to the referendum in '74, there was a referendum to legalize gambling statewide, and it didn't float. So the proponents decided, let's say we're going to do it to revitalize Atlantic City. The Queen of Resorts was down. And I can remember, because I was a reporter assigned to cover Atlantic City, and the whole pitch was this is a means to an end, a unique form of urban renewal. That was the pitch. And they always called it gaming, not gambling. Legalized gaming was going to rebuild the city. And,
Yeah,
and that's
we tried.
the way they sold it.
We try that phrase here too.
Yeah.
Very good. I think the answer is, I mean, if you go back to 1931 when Nevada legalized gambling, I mean, it was economic development. That was the goal. And Nevada was a place that didn't have a lot of prospects in 1931. So, you know, they were grasping a bit. So if you look at Atlantic City, same thing. But really at the time, gambling was a sin in many people's minds. It was not accepted behavior. So you would have to go way out in the desert to do that, or in this case, Atlantic City later. Okay.
Thank you guys for being here.
There it is.
My wife and I grew up in Philly, and my father and his family ran a large meatpacking house. And I want to ask a question about the connection between the Teamsters and organized crime, because as a price of doing business, the trucks that rolled out of his packing house with meat on it, they always assumed there was a certain amount of shrinkage because the Teamsters were selling meat illegally off the trucks and only delivering a portion of what was actually involved. And they were involved in a number of things, such as a trucker strike and basically cooperating with the Philly police to keep the trucks out of the city during it. So I'm just wondering, you haven't mentioned anything about the Teamsters connection to organized crime in Philly. Was this a separate enterprise, or was it somehow integrated into the other stuff you're talking about?
You want to try it, George?
I'm not sure I'm not sure what the point was.
Were the Teamsters involved with organized crime in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I mean, there was a notorious local in Philadelphia, Local 107, that was in itself an organized crime group. The infamous Frank Sheeran came out of that area. The Teamsters at 560 in Union, New Jersey with Tony Provenzano. I mean, I teach a course on organized crime, and one of the elements is organized labor, organized crime. And the Teamsters have, I mean, we talked about this earlier. This place is built with Teamsters Central States Pension Fund money. Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, the Teamsters and the mob have always been like this. And it continues, I think, to this day with various locals, not every local. But yeah, a major, major factor. They provided muscle, they provided money, they provided leverage and influence.
You know, and just for lack of time, we haven't spent much time tonight on corruption, government corruption, but that's a leg of the stool. And Atlantic City talk about that a little bit, Jimmy.
So during the Scarfo era, the mayor at the time, they had corrupted the mayor, Mayor Matthews. He went to prison. That was in 1984. One of the mayors was indicted in the 90s. I think maybe his successor or the one after. Just to bring it up to current day, the previous mayor went to federal prison, and the mayor now is under indictment in state court. I will say this, I know him personally, he's a good man. He's presumed innocent, that's the lawyer in me. But this is not a corruption case, it's something else. But Atlantic City has actually been is under the control of the state. The state has they call it the takeover, but Atlantic City is not autonomous. The state, in essence, controls a lot of it because the government has been ineffective over time. And I think that's another reason that Atlantic City has not prospered, has been because of our government, whereas I think here in Las Vegas, certainly under Oscar Goodman's leadership, Las Vegas thrived, and Atlantic City's government didn't really move it forward.
Now, it seems to me, Jimmy, as I think about this, that the next mayor of Atlantic City should be a criminal defense attorney.
There's a lot of good criminal defense attorneys there. I'm going to nominate someone else, not myself.
Okay. So we have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
This is for George M. You said that the warden, you said it was a long story about how you got out, but are you saying that he was instrumental in your process in getting out when he realized?
The warden.
When
Was
he
the warden
realized
important?
his
Just me
wife.
about my warden? Which warden? There was a lot of
The
wardens.
one whose wife bought the marijuana legally.
Oh, yeah, that particular warden. You know, when you do 32 years, I was a mentor educator. I graduated over 8,000 inmate students, documented, never been done before in the world. But the reason I did so good in prison, I didn't take the credit. You always give the warden the credit. Anybody in prison that's trying to do good and thinks they're going to outshine a warden is but a fool. So I worked right now the reentry program in America, in the feds and states. I created that. I worked very hard from 1992. All the entry programs, early release programs. I was the pioneer with all that, but I didn't take no credit. You know, it's not about helping me. I was dying in prison. I realized I don't want to die here, so I'm going to do the best I can. And thank God, the saints that be, I got out. But wardens are very, they're individuals, they're very powerful, and they're curtailed. They cannot use their power. They have a tremendous power, but they can't do it. But anything, I'm an expert in prison. I
He's a
am an
prison
expert.
We have two prison experts up here. Well, very good. Well, I want to thank you all for your questions, and please give our panel a round of applause. Please. Great job.